Well, hello, everybody. We have covered a lot of ground in class, and today, as a part of our asynchronous class on July 29th, I really just want to help you have a new skill, a skill that I think is really valuable for people doing policy work, and that is to know about logic models and building a logic model. And so, what am I hoping? Well, I'm hoping that by the end of this little video, have been introduced to a logic model. You'll have the skills necessary to think about some of the information that you need to build a logic model, and it also helps you to think in terms of evaluating policy and policy options that exist. It's another technique or approach. Um, and then that you would actually be able to take and build your own logic model to help to develop a program or policy that you're interested in. And this is all about logic trains, and logic trains are clarity of thought, right? It's a theory of action. So logic models are related to the idea of a theory of action. So what's the theory that we're using? Not theory in the sense of a academic theory that has been empirically tested, but a theory in terms of if we do these activities, it will lead to a certain type of change. And so that's a theory of action. Policy has a theory of action that if we implement this policy, we're going to see XYZ changes, and those changes are desirable in some way. So why a logic model? Well, one of the things that we know in policy discussions is that all policies and the related programs have intended consequences, but they also have unintended consequences, and often they also have spillover effects. And so, well, what are intended consequences? Let's talk testing for a moment. If you think about the policy of implementing testing in schools, well, what are the intended consequences? Well, the intended consequence is to gain information, to understand where different student learners are at, and to use that information in turn to make some sort of changes in how we deliver education so that we might help students to achieve in different ways. One of the unintended consequences of testing in schools is that teachers changed how they taught in order to teach towards tests. That wasn't necessarily desirable, but it's an unintended consequence associated with testing. And then, what are spillover effects? Well, a spillover effect of testing might, in fact, be the rise of the testing companies and the impact that testing companies are having on curriculum and teaching in schools. And so we have a program or a policy that was implemented through, the program of testing, and we have intended consequences, we have an unintended consequences, and then we have some effects that were perhaps anticipated, but they spilled over from what was intended. So one of the things I want to share with you is my view that policy and program work is a socially situated practice. It's not just a social practice, but it is a socially situated practice. And what's important here is that it's a complex capability. It's not just a discrete set of skills. So you can't do good policy just by having policy skills. It's a complex capability that takes more than that. We often develop these complex capabilities when we work on problems that are relevant to us. So each of you in class, I've asked you to work on things that are relevant to you, to think about things you care about, because we develop our capabilities related to thinking about policy by working on things that we care about, policy options, policy concerns that are front and center to us. And so that's often the case. One thing about complex capabilities is that we often learn them best through mentorship. And so I think part of the way I've tried to think about setting up the class is to have discussion, to mentor around ideas, and have your peers be able to talk through with you different ideas as well. All of this then is really helps us to understand that the same policies and practices in different contexts yields different results. So testing in one school system does not yield the same results as testing in a second school system, and testing in one school building does not necessarily have the same results as testing in another building. Just as the same testing practice in one classroom of the third grade does not necessarily have the same results as a second classroom in a third grade. They may have similarities, but the same practice and policy implemented in different contexts really ends up with different results, hence socially situated practice. Thinking in logic trains also is all about creating ways to gather systemic information. And one of the things I want you to understand from my point of view is that all of us bring to any situation our own internal biases and lenses. And I might argue that it's impossible to put our biases and lenses down. And of course, that's a whole positionality discussion in qualitative and quantitative research. But one of the things that we know is that we each do come with lenses, we come with biases, and that systemic information helps us as practitioners, as policymakers, to reflect upon what our biases are, to go beyond ourselves, hopefully, to see other perspectives that ultimately change how we might act. So systemic information is valuable to help us overcome our own limitations of sight, our own limitations of experience, to hear other experiences, to appreciate those experiences, to learn from them, to reflect upon them, and ultimately to make change or action. And so part of developing a logic model is creating a systemic ways to think about and expand our own thinking related to programs and policy implementation. So what is a logic model? Well, this is a logic model. This is a logic model that is contemporary. It's related to a program that's in action right now from the state of California. And a logic model is literally identification of the resources that go into a program or policy implementation, the activities of that program or policy, and then anticipated outputs, or what is the process indicators that something is happening, and then what are short and long-term outcomes. In this example, you see a logic model associated with a special education project for the state of California. It is a grant funded, so it's a policy, a grant funded program that tries to increase inclusion in early childhood education. And so there's a specific allocation of resources in terms of the grant. There's a number of staff. There's a whole lot of partnerships. And then there's work that is actually done with local education areas, that's LEA partners. And then you can see that there's actually a set of activities. So what are the activities that are being implemented by the policy of grant funding for special education for early childhood? And then what actually happens based upon those planned activities, right? So, you can have a boot camp, but what actually happens is there's a certain number of sessions with a certain number of people who attend the boot camp. It may be a professional network, but then there's actually the number of meetings of the professional network is the actual outputs. And what you really see in this orange box in the middle is process indicators of activities that are listed in the green box. And then in turn, you see a connection between, well, if the outputs actually happen in the orange box, then what would literally change for people in this yellow box? And what changes is often people's knowledge, their attitudes, and hopefully a little bit of their behavior. And so you see listed here, increased knowledge of early childhood practices for discipline. Knowledge of early childhood culturally relevant pedagogy would increase. The use of that pedagogy might also increase. But we're hoping if people attend training, if they participate in the activities of the grant, that their knowledge and attitudes towards practices shift, and that would also then lead to some shifts in what they actually do with kids. And then in the long term, of course, that means that there would actually be a change in early childhood inclusion practices across schools sites in the state of California. And so here you have a whole logic train that's set up that's about the resources, activities, outputs, short-term and long-term outcomes. Okay, so here's a second example of this. And what I ultimately want you to do is to be able to create your own. So you have a set of inputs or resources. This is a science program, the Get Real Science program. And this is a grant-funded program, so a policy to try to increase science capabilities in teachers. And so you see that there is a set of inputs, and then secondly, that are identified, and secondly, there's a set of core activities associated with the grant that is reacting to this policy associated with funding programs to increase science capabilities. And so you see that there are these 5 core program experiences, there's ongoing professional development, and then there's teacher curriculum expectations. And then you see, well, this is what actually happens is you have 12 annual participants who complete the core program requirements, that there are 50 annual participants who are in professional development for up to 5 years, and there are 12 annual participants doing curriculum reform expectations. Well, what changes for those people? What changes is their knowledge. What changes is their commitment to serving traditionally underserved science students. What changes is their increased commitment to fostering students' understandings of the nature of science. And so these literally are the immediate outcomes, what actually changes for people as a result of participation in the programs. And of course, then the long-term outcomes is usually what the policy is aiming for, which is we want to increase inquiry-based science instruction. We want to increase the ability of instructors to do inquiry-based science instruction. We want to engage traditionally marginalized students in science. So those are examples of long-term outcomes, and they connect, right, logically across these fields. So you have these resources that connect explicitly to these activities, which are then connected explicitly to the outputs, which are then again explicitly connected to what is a realistic and logical immediate outcomes, which are then connected, if those outcome happens, conceptually to what could happen in the longer term should those immediate outcomes occur. And so that's really the idea of a logic model. And logic models become really important in grant-funded activities. Public policymakers use them often to help to illustrate what's going to happen from policy adoption to policy implementation. So I hope this little video is helpful to help you craft your own logic model, introduce this idea, and be able to come up with your own example.